Thanks so much for joining us for this podcast. This is a special edition. I haven't done anything like this before. Usually they're a lot more planned out and like it just, I'm going to an emergency press conference. And for those of you who have been following along, I've been really trying to actively improve my training. I've been doing high rock running endurance competition, trying to get myself back to elite form like I was back when I was in college, almost 15 years ago or whatever it is now. And so I recently got my cardiopulmonary testing done, put some stuff out on Instagram. Rory here reached out graciously and said, not that anybody asked, but I'm seeing some issues here. And truthfully, in my career as a strength and conditioning coach in professional sports, I never really had to worry about this kind of stuff. Like stuff you worried about, but we were working with the best athletes in the world, and they were already pretty finely tuned. So I never really had to dive into the nitty gritty like this. And now that I'm on the outside and working with the general population, this stuff has gotten way bigger in my eyes. So I jumped on the chance and begged and pleaded Rory to join me for a podcast here. And Rory and I met mere minutes ago. So why don't you take us in here, introduce yourself to the audience, introduce yourself to me as well. I'm going to be learning along the way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is a good opportunity because sometimes people reach out and they're like, what is it that you do? So kind of where I'm at this point in my career, and I've kind of worn a lot of hats. I'm an exercise physiologist, and what that entails is, whether it's a general populace person getting a yearly checkup, or it's a cardiology patient, someone who is a tougher case, we put them on a treadmill, we put them on a bike. We do what's called a stress test or cardiopulmonary exercise test. And we basically measure, inhaled oxygen, exhaled CO2, respiratory rate, total ventilation, how big their breaths are. And I also will throw on an EKG to these people as well to assess cardiac function. And that's kind of that's the main piece of what I do from a day-to-day. Some of my populace, I do some more counseling, which is where all those hats come into play. Try to meet people where they're at. So I'm not evenly split, but I am working with general populace. I'm working with clinical populace. And I'm also working with athletes. Otherwise, I come from team sport. I was a soccer player and surfing, but surfers are not necessarily exercisers. But so those are the kind of the two things that were my foundation. And getting into my 30s, I've shifted more towards endurance sports, and specifically, bringing some of that surfing background in. I do more paddling. So those that follow me will see me talking a lot about prone paddling. So no paddle or anything, just the arms. But that's what I, nerd out on, and it's my passion. And so yeah, that's kind of the quick of it. Went to school, got a graduate degree in exercise science, specifically exercise physiology. And before that, I was a strength and conditioning coach, and I have a background in PRI like you do. So I like to try and bring all those components in. But yeah, I think that's kind of the skinny of it. Yeah.
You keep talking PRI like that, man. We have to extend this conversation another 5 hours.
I won't broach too far into that, just because it's the XPhys and PRI world. It's there's a lot that we still need to learn, but I think there's a piece, and I think one day that'll make up more of my research and my direction.
Yeah. So I think like most of I don't want to bros out there, but there's definitely a bro science culture to like the Andrew Huberman people, the Huberman bros. Yeah. Peter Attia is really getting his name out there in terms of like the longevity stuff. And I don't know for sure, but it was Peter Attia who seemingly made VO2 Max a popular data point to collect, and even a pretty compelling point in the book. One of the things I liked a lot about it was, well, it wasn't something that you can just, grind it out for 2 weeks and you get a good score. Like this is like an accumulation over a long period of time, and that it was like, okay, like that's indicative of somebody who has been putting in the work, and it really speaks to me of who I am as a person, an athlete, and a business person. So what I'm curious of is but that's where I started, right? So like that's where I'll get the two. So they're gonna hook me up to this thing. They're gonna give me that. They give me all sorts of data. Um, let me bridge it to you this way. What is, to you who does this for a living? Where does the VO2 max stand on on a general cardiopulmonary test? It's like where rank in like the top and like in the all the different data points that you're getting?
Well, with general populace or clinical populace, it's number one. It's the culmination of, the rate at which you take the oxygen into your body, right? So, there's an ability to inhale and expand the lungs. Then now you need to diffuse that oxygen within the lungs, take that with the heart, pump it through your body. So now you got the cardiac and the vascular function, and then you need to take it up in the muscles. So there's kind of the peripheral infrastructure there. It's a measure of all those things working together. Obviously, and then there's the nervous system governing all of this, and that's a major piece as well. So it's number one. In my cardiology patients, I'm looking more closely at that because we have better data on what someone is capable of between a 15 VO2 max and a 25 VO2 max. And I've seen both of those numbers before. And when I do general populace, we're anywhere from the 30s to the 50s, right? And then I've tested athletes up into the high 70s. So what's interesting about all of that is just the sheer range to be able to have one person who's 15 and another person who's 85. I don't know if there's any other species out there that experiences that, and that's largely a product of choice. We have more choice than the other animals on this planet, and so that's, I'm imagining, is the main reason for variance in that. But like, what a huge range! So it's number one, but we are looking at a lot of other things like. We are looking at pulmonary function specifically. We are looking at cardiac function specifically. And if you use something like the Moxie monitor, you're looking at peripheral function in its own category. So I like to try and find them all, but VO2 max still reigns supreme.
Okay. So VO2 max, just so I want to be clear. So like what in my mind, when I say VO2 max, I'm like hazy on really exactly what it is. Like I say it's like the maximal rate of oxygen consumptions like that, during like intense exercises, like what's highest point, what's the highest intensity where my oxygen consumption is able to keep up with that demand. Am I right on?
Yeah, and that's why these cardiopulmonary exercise tests or VO2 max tests, that's why actually they're called stress tests, because your body is mobilizing a response to increasing stress.
Okay. And then what are you seeing? I mean, this is just like a fun question. What are you seeing in these athletes who are in the 70s and 80s? Are they cyclists? Are they runners? Like I've always heard that like the Tour de France guys are the guys at the highest level VO2 wise. What's the commonality there?
Yeah. So, well, the commonality is usually copious amounts of time training. But I've done runners with high VO2 maxes, cyclists, and if we had a need for it in San Diego, I would do cross-country skiing, which would see the largest VO2 maxes. So
cross-country skiing, see the largest?
Yeah. And
why is that?
It's a product of involved muscle mass. So you're adding arms to the leg exercise. And following on that line is you will see lower VO2 maxes in cyclists, or not in cyclists, but take someone who does two different tests. They do a run test, they do a cycling test. You're going to see a lower VO2 max in the cycling test. And then if you take that person and you are able to do a swim test, potentially you'll see, well, not necessarily swim, but you see, take myself, for instance, I run, cycle, and I paddle. My paddle VO2 max is going to be the lowest by far.
Okay. So I absolutely love that. It's a product of involved muscle mass. And that, I guess, kind of brings me to so this experience getting this cardiopulmonary testing done for me was the first time that I realized that it wasn't just a singular number that we're looking at here in terms of what my VO2 max is. I'm looking at my Apple Watch and it says I'm a 50. Then I go to this place, I hop on a bike to do the test. They come back with a 41 and I'm rattled, right? I'm like, geez, that track was just okay. So but I was thinking I'm way crappier than I thought I was. And then and I dug into the results that they see a little bit. And I did see that they did mention that a cycling versus a walking, jogging, running VO2 or at least zone 2 was going to change. How does, what's the deal there? So is it the product of involved muscle mass that is contributing or dictating the fact that there are different ones for different activities?
Yeah, no, that's what it is. And to go a step further with that, cycling is a crank. You're just cranking over and over and over again. And especially when we do these tests in the lab, usually it's on quote unquote erg mode. Cyclists will understand what erg mode means, but there's not really any coasting. It's just consistent resistance all the way through the stroke. Now take that and compare it to the most efficient movement we do, and for good reason, is locomotion. So when you are doing a running or a walking test, because of that efficiency, you're able to activate yourself to such a high degree that your heart and lungs become the limiting factor. But if you're not conditioned to cycling and you can't handle that muscular endurance, your legs are going to peter out before your heart and lungs do. Now, in very deconditioned populaces, in a walking test, their legs will fatigue out before their heart and lungs do, and that's a bad sign. That is an indication of a sedentary lifestyle.
So obviously, so then if I were to take a VO2 max test on a treadmill running, I would get possibly a dramatically different score because I run way more than I cycle.
Yeah.
Is there a VO2 max? I know that's somewhat limited. Do you have one that's preferred? Do you prefer to do it on do you get a better data? Is it more indicative of health, longevity on a treadmill? Is there one that's better than the other?
Well, I think it depends on the hat I'm wearing that day. With most general populace people, I push them towards the treadmill, either for a walking or a running test. And honestly, preferably a hill walking test, especially if we're doing concurrent electrocardiogram, because you get better readings from the electrodes. But not everyone can run. And then running with the mask on can be a problem, especially if you use, a mixing chamber VO2 device where it has a big old tube on it and people can't see their feet and that stresses them out. Now, if I'm putting on my PRI hat, I'm saying all roads lead to locomotion. I'm saying that gait is the foundation for all of these systems kind of meshing well together. And I want to see that. If I'm looking at the person holistically, I want to see how these systems interplay, and if I'm good enough in the PRI realm, I can make some assumptions based on table tests and what the output is when they are walking, and that's rarely done. That's hard to do. It's kind of tip of the sword in my field. And probably literally N = 5 when it comes to people that are looking at that specifically. But but also too, I've talked about this on my socials before, is, sometimes you'll see resting lung function won't make sense to exercising lung function. And you're saying, okay, well, what is going on with the movement that's not allowing this translation? Like, your lungs are great at rest, but now they're compromised during exercise. What is that? Why is that happening? So, you can really get that information cleaner information to a higher degree with a walking or a running test, just because that's our circuitry. That's what we're made to do.
So to clarify for everybody listening, there's going to be people all walks of life here. When we talk PRI stands for Postural Restoration Institute. It is the science in which I base pretty much everything that I've ever done off of. And we're looking at the quality of human movement. When we say gait mechanics, we're talking about how well does the body walk, right? And gait mechanics is quite a bit more detailed than just walking, and expands the entire body. But what I think Rory's saying here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're skewing towards the walking test, towards the treadmill test, because it's predictive of that gait mechanics, which, as PRI folks and myself included, would also say that is optimal. That's optimal biomechanics, the optimal way to move the body. So if we're looking at the product of involved movement is what VO2 max is measuring, why not create that picture and that data around the thing you're trying to optimize? How was my description there?
No, that was great. And you'll see this very, very readily when you put someone on the bike that's not used to the bike, and their max heart rate is much lower than what it should be. And they're just not efficient enough. They don't have the ability to stress their heart and lungs because their legs are underpowered in that modality. So it's just, I push people towards walking as much as I can, because I can further stress the heart and lungs and thus see what's going wrong.
Yeah. I think I'm super interested. Go over to like HS, get a treadmill VO2 max test just to compare and contrast. But what I want to get to is, I do. And actually, last thing on VO2 max before we dive on to the next thing, I was kind of scrolling through your Instagram there for a second, like accuracy and Garmin and Apple and Whoop. And I actually had the same response with Whoop, where the Whoop band, at least real-time heart data, is like way off. And it looked like Garmin was on the money there too, at least in real heart rate data. I've always felt that Apple Watch is really good. It's just a little laggy, right? Like, it takes it a little bit to display my real heart rate is if it's moving around. Like, if I'm trying to get in a specific zone, I'm pretty sure I'm there, but it's still got me, 10 beats lower or something like that. Overall thoughts on these smart watches, and just so everybody knows, is popular. Rory's got it on his Instagram. It was like 30 beats a minute off. I always felt that way about Whoop, and I don't think they've got that tech right. But overall thoughts on like measuring a VO2 max, using it as a heart monitor for these smartwatches. And I saw you actually had a bunch of on cardiac recovery as well. Just what are your thoughts on general accuracy of these watches?
Yeah, so we're at a point now in the technology that it should be there. We shouldn't have to worry about the PPG sensors on our wrists. They all should be pretty all right. Now, a lot of this does matter when it comes to how you're wearing it, how tightly it's worn. And so that's kind of the first piece. I have a friend who has tattoos over the spot that he wears it, and he gets poor readings from that.
That's dedication.
Yeah. But, it's really good for steady state stuff, and it's really good for stuff you're not using your hands for. So if you're rowing, cycling, paddling, I would prefer you're wearing a chest strap. And then they're not so great when it comes to intervals. So quick heart rate acceleration, it's going to lag behind. I've had people say that their Garmin is poor. I've never had that experience. And usually when someone's on my treadmill, they usually have a smartwatch, and I key it up against my EKGs. And yeah, Apple Watches tend to be pretty well on. Whoop is the worst one I've seen. Garmin's are good. Samsung Galaxies are good. But yeah, you really want the chest strap because PPG is shining a light into your arteries. To watching the blood flow pass each beat, that is subject to blood pressure. It's subject to.
And just let me jump in there. That's the optical that flashy green light.
Yes,
right?
the flashing green light under your watch there, shining light into your blood vessels, watching blood pass with each beat, and that is subject to be affected by movement of your limbs or muscle contracture. So we want to use a chest strap, which goes off of the electricity of your heart, which is the same thing that my 12-lead EKG does. I just have 10 different leads on.
So wait, what is that? What is that chest strap? What's that chest strap measuring then?
It's measuring
measuring heart rate, but how?
Yeah, it's the electrical impulse through your heart. So it just catches the electricity as it goes through your heart. And so when you see the lines on the EKG, a positive line is just moving from a negative to positive, right? And then positive to negative is a negative. Like it's just seeing it pass through. Now you don't get that same granularity with the chest strap, but you do get the impulse and it reads it. And so as fast as your heart goes is as fast as it reads.
Okay, guys, if you're listening to this, you got to follow Rory on Instagram. He's got so much really cool stuff on there and breaking it down. And it's this kind of stuff. And you've got to see I mean, it's really interesting to see the real time comparison between these different tech spots and the EKG. Like this is the kind of stuff that, and I think it's gained popularity, and he's got some really good stuff on there. So
thank you.
Definitely check him out there. What I want to dive into here as we roll the second half is what prompted you to, God knows, I don't even know what I posted. You know how it goes. But I put something out there and you were, something caught your eye to lead you to send a message. What would you say?
Well, actually, it was a client of mine who is in New York and follows you as well. I was already following you, but okay. he said, "Hey, what do you think about this?" And I love when people do that. It's so fun, just giving me stuff to learn more and dive into. When I saw it, I also saw concurrently what you're training for, and the modality was non-specific to what your goals are. And so my first thought was that discussion we had on not being efficient on a bike and what that response is then going to look like on a cardiopulmonary exercise test. So, seeing that you're in the low 40s on the bike, it sounds like your watch is probably pretty close on to what your actual VO2 max is if you were on your feet. And so that for me is like, oh man, that's something I see all the time. So I was like, why don't I reach out and just see what he thinks about this? Because ideally you would do a run test. If Hyrox is your sport, man, it's a lot of running. So you should be running. But also not more so, but similarly, when you're lifting and using those large amounts of muscle mass, like your heart rate is going to be just completely it's just not going to make sense to your cycling test. So, you're where you think you're at when you're at zone 2 intensity, where you think you're at when you're at threshold intensity. If you're going off of those cycling zones, then it's going to confuse you. And also, if you trust in the cycling zones and apply it to other things, not saying that you were, but if you were to do that, then you're going to train very, very ineffectively.
So I'm going to pull up my data, and for anybody who's watching online, I'll pull it up there. But what they had me in, so they find it. They had the specific like zone 1, zone 2 for cycling, zone 2 for cycling. They had me at 91 to 111, whereas for walking, jogging, treadmill it would be 101 to 122. How much am I able to trust that 101 to 122 based off of the cycling test?
Well, you trust it for cycling.
So that's what I'm saying. So like is this just an estimate? Like their zone 2 bait. So they're saying, yeah, cycling, 102, 91 to 111, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then my walking, jogging, treadmill is 101 to 122. Is that just kind of like algorithmic?
So yes, it is. And I'm imagining, just based on your age, that it's too low. So like what's the highest heart rate that you've seen in training in the last 3 years?
I'm going to say, I know I get into the upper 170s. I feel like I've seen like 181 or 184, but I don't know. I can't confirm for sure that I've seen that. I just feel like I've seen that.
Okay. So let's just say 180 to be safe. And was that lifting or running or both?
Probably running.
Probably running. Okay. So these thresholds, even though they can shift and change, they generally fall within certain percentiles of max heart rate and certain percentiles of max VO2. So if you're at 180 beats per minute at your max, it's likely that your first threshold, which defines the top end of your zone 2, it's very likely that you're at least in the 130s. Now, if you were to go run at 122, you'd probably be like in a low zone 2. It wouldn't kill you. But
okay,
when I'm guiding someone with exercise prescription, I want them only biasing, 5 to 10 beats below that first threshold. Maybe
right.
5, it's all context dependent. So it looks too low to me. If you're running in those zones, I mean, you're doing great in fat oxidation. You got very low lactate levels, I would imagine. And so you're getting some benefit there. You're keeping it relatively parasympathetic. You're able to build up a lot of volume because this more parasympathetically shifted exercise is not inducing a large recovery need. But at a certain point, you're going to build up all this volume, and you really could be working just a little bit harder and increasing those rates, those oxidation rates just a little bit higher.
Yeah. So last year last year's the first year I would say that I was like really training to run. I mean, I did it maybe 2-3 years ago where I was kind of kicking into it a little bit. Knee started bumping me, so I stopped. But last year I was the first time I ever ran a 10-mile race, longest I've ever run to this point as well. And the zone 2 low tech test is the talking test, right? It's like the described to me was you should be able to have a breathy conversation. Like I'm running and I'm like, if somebody asks me what I'm having for dinner, I'll be like, I have chicken strips, right? Like I can say it, but I can't I'm not going to have a big conversation here. But I'm able to have conversation. When I can't speak is when I've gone over that threshold. And so I'm training for this 10-mile run, man, I felt like I was still able to produce that zone 2 breathy conversation into the low 160s. Thoughts?
Yeah. So I like the talk test, but it almost is better served in a pretty strict lab setting, which, I mean, if you're in the lab already, hopefully you have access to these other tools to figure out your zone 2. So, that sounds too high to me. If your max is, around 180, if you're hitting 160, I mean, you're more than likely right at your second threshold. And that's like
into zone 3.
That's zone 4, right? If we're doing the 5-zone model. Now, if you're doing the 3-zone model, then yes, you're right, into zone 3.
Okay.
And we could talk more about the 3-zone model. It's actually a model that I prefer, but no watches are made that way.
All right.
So we have to deal with the 5 zones, and there's a whole lot of art to figuring out how to make them. But yes, zone 4 in a 5-zone model, or in that last intensity. So, the talk test, it's really, really important that the person is well versed in where that threshold lies when it comes to respiration. And everyone's a little different. I have some respiratory limitations. So my talk test puts out a lower first threshold, which is the top of our zone 2, just to remind everyone. It puts a lower first threshold because it's not as easy for me to maintain conversations even within my zone 2. And that's just because of lung pathology. So that's why a lot of these cardiopulmonary exercise tests will be preceded by resting lung function, or a spirometry test, as it's called, which is what we do. So, I like the talk test. I just think that it's supposed to be a field test. But when it's done in the field, it's still subject to a lot of independent variables.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're going to use the talk test, you're probably not diving super deep into like these, like the data. You probably don't have an Apple Watch, or at least you're not looking at those kind of things, which, whatever, that's your personal preference. But one of the questions I had is, so I go get this testing. They write back, and they say back, they're like, look, you got to do zone 2 training for, X amount of 2 hours was their recommendation per week. And, I get a lot of people come sit in this office, and I'll get a guy who'll be like, yeah, I think I need to do more zone 2. And I'm always just like, Peter Attia, you listen to his podcast. And and look, I have great respect for Peter Attia. I think he's actually pretty sharp. And well, like I'm getting so many people like saying that, and it's become so popularized to the point I'm almost like, as the inner contrarian, I'm like, screw zone 2. Like, it's just everybody's doing it. It's like too popular for me now, right? Like, I like to do different stuff. So here's what I'm not sure of. Like, my question is, what is zone 2? My understanding of it. So have you read Ultimate MMA Conditioning by Joel Jamieson?
I know of it. I took his cert, but I did not read that.
Okay. Yeah. So did I. So that was really, when I started working for the Diamondbacks, like that was like the book that they were going to base conditioning off of. And it is interesting because when he talks about and he doesn't actually label it zone 2, but when he talks about aerobic capacity, he actually has, in the book, he's got a 120 to 140 range and a 130 to 150 range. It just pops up the range. You're like, whoa, I thought it was the other one. So that always confused me. But in the book, the way he describes it is that it's eccentric ventricular hypertrophy, meaning that you are expanding the ventricle of the heart and allowing it to hold more blood. More blood's in there, more oxygen's in there, more can get out to the muscles. So you spend, 30 to 90 minutes per his recommendations. And from 130 to 150, I always went with that one just because I can't go with one that's I'm just built that way. So I go 130 to 150, and I hit that. And I do that for usually 50 minutes or so. I have gone up to 45 in an hour, I think. That really actually took a lot out of me to do that. But when people say zone 2, obviously, I guess we're going off the 5-zone model. What are we talking about here?
Yeah. So the top of zone 2 is determined by the first ventilatory threshold or the first lactate threshold. So they tend to fall around the same area.
Is that anaerobic threshold?
In a clinical setting, yes, it is the anaerobic threshold. But I don't want to confuse anyone because there's 3 different ways in which we can figure this out, right? There is measuring carbon dioxide. There is measuring total ventilation as it relates to oxygen consumption. And there is the first uptick in lactate in your blood. And we're still debating whether they're tied together or they're not. It seems more likely than not, just in what I've been reading, and I may be wrong one day, but it seems like they are. But there's 3 different ways of measuring it. Now, just don't worry about that for now. That first ventilatory threshold, what I think is most interesting is the change in the nervous system at that point. It's definitely, there's a neurogenic component to this. And so, like, I got a post on my Instagram that is showing heart rate variability during exercise on one of these ramp tests that you did that we're talking about. And you see HRV at its highest points until that first threshold, and then it plummets. And in younger populaces, this will happen somewhere between 140 beats per minute, to 160 beats per minute. And when that happens, it's really only been parasympathetic withdrawal up to that point. And now the sympathetic branch is getting involved. So personally, when I'm prescribing, explaining, trying to understand this in a cardiopulmonary exercise test, I always like to look back to the nervous system and say, all right, the body just went from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3 or whichever way it goes, it just upregulated it mobilized its military, right? Before it was this isn't much. And then you cross that threshold and it's all right, this is actually kind of serious. And that's a good holistic approach to when you're training yourself or training your people and helping them understand the stressors of exercise and kind of what capacity that they have. So that's kind of that piece of it. A lot of people will talk about mitochondrial, biogenesis. A lot of people talk about capillary density. What you were mentioning, improving stroke volume by improving end diastolic volume. So basically the blood gets shunted into that left ventricle. And because you're not going at 170 beats per minute, it has the opportunity to fully fill and eccentrically stress the left ventricle. And then you get this nice big contraction. So you're promoting your cardiac output. Now, this isn't the only zone where any of those things happen, but they do happen, and they happen with a relatively low degree of stress, and that brings us back to the nervous system. So really, what Zone 2 is, it's a place to receive wonderful training benefits and do it in a lot of volume. And you worked with high-level athletes that, in the end of the day, you guys were just trying to figure out how much work can we get them to do, right? What's that limit, right? Before they break down, how many kilojoules can they put out? Because that is how the body sees this need for adaptation. If you overshoot, then you don't have the ability to recover from it. You won't grow from it. So it's basically just playing this game of how much work can I do and still recover from? And Zone 2 plays a vital role in that.
Okay. That is awesome. That is exactly what I was hoping you would say. Okay. I got two more questions.
Okay.
And one of them is insane. One of them is a good one, but not insane, but just whatever. So the first thing, I'm putting this thing out. It's marathon science, right? So actually give me 1 second here.
Yeah.
Jessica? I'm just on a call. I'm just finishing. Yeah, we got 2 of them right there. I'll be done in 10 minutes. All right. For some good old-fashioned editing there. But okay. So I'm putting out this thing called marathon science, and I'm trying to figure out really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out the best way to train for endurance, right? To get my muscles and get my body to sustain energy production sustain health over a long period of time. I'm not necessarily trying to run a marathon. I think I've positioned myself, put myself in a little bit of a corner where I kind of have to now, and that's fine. I'm totally down to do that. But my concern is that over the course of 26.2 miles, look, that's a lot. It's a lot of volume on my legs, and the training volume on that. I know from my background that it is really hard to run efficiently. All not just the 26 racing miles, but all the volume in the training side as well. So I'm like, I don't want to put too much on my knees, on my Achilles, stuff like that. So like my thought is like, can I build this like aerobic metabolism, this aerobic engine inside within, cardiovascular wise, from like, cardio steady state machines, circuit training, whatever it is that we can do inside of the gym. Obviously not getting full effect because we want it to be happening in the legs and then through the running and walking gait mechanics. But how much can I realistically build inside of a gym in terms of like that aerobic metabolism, that long sustaining energy production without getting out on the pavement?
You're probably not going to like my answer.
I want the truth. That's what I want.
So there's people that have tried it. So that might be a place you want to go to look at, how they did. But there's always this discussion about central and peripheral and what plays a part. When you're talking, going that many hours, right, of constant movement, peripheral adaptations are so important. And you're not necessarily doing a low impact sport. So right. If someone, I don't like it. I don't like it. You got to get out and run.
Gotta get out there.
You got to get out there. You got to put the miles in. And I'm speaking to someone who has a base of sorts, right? Who's spent time on your feet, and you're not going to be that person on the treadmill whose legs are going to fatigue out before your central systems. Like I kind of just already know that, right? So, at least in terms of finishing the marathon and not worrying about how fast you go, it's just volume. You got to get that volume up. You got to go that distance, right? I'm doing this now in a new sport. I've done it with running before, you breaking through barriers and training to get you to new distances. I'm doing that now in paddling, and it's fun to revisit that experience of going that distance and then reframing your mind of what that distance actually is, where you used to think 10 miles was a lot, right? And now 10 miles is like, that's like a midweek training, right? So you need that experience, and you can't get that in the gym. Now, it doesn't mean that, something like circuit training isn't going to help your cardiovascular system. It most definitely is. But the issue there is that with, circuit training, something that's non-rhythmic, even though it's bringing your heart rate and respiration rate up, your VO2 is actually lower, right? So every time you exercise, you have a VO2 reading, right? We always talk about max, but we don't really talk about what's in between. And so if you do circuit training and live at these certain heart rates, and then you go out and run and do those exact same heart rates, you just follow it perfectly, your VO2 levels will be much higher in the running, and you will receive much better adaptations for that endurance activity.
Yeah. As I had this question on my sheet here for the entire conversation, and the more you spoke, the more I understood where that response would take it. So I appreciate the transparency there, and you got to do what you got to do. 26.2 is challenging no matter how you slice. Okay, last question I got is, I think in terms of like running on stuff like that, like obviously I want to perform, like you also talking to a guy who does care about the time, right? Like I want to do it well. I want to be, my real goal, true goal over the next 365 days is to be at High Rocks World Championships next year. From an exercise physiology standpoint, what needs to happen? What do I need to do? What do people listening to this need to do to be elite? Like, I don't, like, when I go to these CPED tests, and they're like, you fall in the norm. Oh, you're above average. Like, doesn't work for me. Got to be on the elite category. Or what do I need to do here to do that?
All right. So what do you need to do to be elite? Well, obviously the step one is to do more than you did last week. From a foundational aspect, you need to do more than you did last week. I'm going to try not to give you all the answers that people roll their eyes on, like consistency.
I want the truth. I really want is the truth. I am, you know what I want? It doesn't matter to me if people roll their eyes at it. That I want the reality.
Yeah. Well, so you need to get assessed, and you've already started that. You need to know, what is your physiology? Where are your thresholds? And then what do those thresholds mean in the course of long-term athletic development? And once you understand those, and I talk about all the time that you need heart rate zones for every activity that you do, because now you can calculate load, right? Some people use like a TRIMP model, which is basically like when you're in zone 1, it's like a 1 times multiplier. When you're in zone 2, it's a 2 times multiplier. And so you just basically take your minutes in each zone, and then you come up with a number of cardiac load, right? So you need to have all those zones so that you can understand what your load is. Mileage is great, duration is great. Those are all helpful and a part of the process, but you need this extra bit of, what stress is my physiology under? And why do we need to understand stress? We need to understand stress because we are trying to stress ourselves maximally and still recover from it. We are trying to put out the most work we possibly can and still survive and do more next week. So that is the 1,000-foot view of becoming elite. The best time to start was years ago, and the next best time is right now, to start building that base of the pyramid so you can reach high. So there's a lot of people that want to believe that you can just zone to your way all the way to elite levels. That is not the case. There needs to be a place of high intensity interval training on your feet, not just in the gym. And so now understand, what's the benefits of high intensity interval training? Well, you can do it in very low volumes, right? And so your specific typology, and I say typology because like a lot of this does come down to like fiber type. You need to figure out what distribution of the low aerobic stuff can you do, and what can you do of the high aerobic stuff, right? So, and then from a long-term athletic development process, you're basically dancing those two variables throughout the months, right? Based on your assessments, right? And based on your load calculations. And then usually you find yourself closer to like what the race pace is or the race experience is as you get closer to the event. So that's kind of my overall rubric to quote unquote being elite. Now that could be very long zone 2 bouts. That could be 4x4 VO2 max intervals. I encourage everyone to not be biased against a tool and to implement it, feel it, see what it does for them, but always be measuring, right? So that's where that cardiopulmonary exercise test comes in. That's where you need these kind of field tests along the way. You need these benchmarks, and working in pro sports, benchmarks are quite the necessity, because what gets measured gets managed.
Sure. HRV, resting heart rate recovery, general like recovery stuff, sleep score, stuff getting from an Aura ring. What am I missing? Anything else that must track?
No, I like all those metrics. If you were to go the next step in tracking, it'd probably, the learning curve to these devices and the cost would be prohibitive. So we want to go off of what we can use readily, what our clientele can use readily. So still, even with that, HRV, there's a lot of research out there on how to track HRV in high level athletes, and it's not straightforward. And I tell people this all the time that, my highest sustained HRV was when I was on paternity leave. I was not sleeping well. I was eating the same. I was exercising kind of relatively the same. I just wasn't going to work. I love work. But there's something about it that plummets my HRV. And so, we're still at the end of the day, very complex organisms, and you need the reps. You need to get a lot of people's HRVs under your belt, watching them, watching your own, using these devices as autonomous diaries. That's really what they are. They are diaries to your health, to your activity, to your rhythms. And this information is invaluable. And so what I do is I just go a step further, and I put my sicknesses on, I put different training bouts on, different races, different routines. And when you do that, you leverage it to a much higher degree, just using resting heart rate, just using HRV, just using your exercise heart rate and your sleep.
Outstanding. Listen, I have obviously a million other questions. Maybe we'll have to jump on for a part 2 at some point. I'm genuinely grateful and appreciative of you taking time to this. I know you are busy. You've got a lot going on, and this just is so spur of the moment. So I'm grateful for just sure. I'll do this and share what I got. So I thank you for that. Hopefully, I'll thank you from the world stage next year as they bestow the medal upon me.
I love it.
But thank you so much again. Let the people know where they can find you quickly before we head out.
Yeah, just Sutherly on Instagram. That's probably the quickest place for everyone to see me. I do have a website, Sutherly Performance, but it's not as active as my Instagram. I'm open to DMs and questions. I like talking about this stuff. So yeah, just Sutherly.
Standing. I'll try to put some of that in the show notes. I've never actually done that before, but I've heard people say it, so there must be a way to do it. So we'll figure that out. But Ray, thanks again so much, and go get some recovery out there.
Yes, sir. All right, you have a good one. Thank you.